The Arabian Sea at 3 a.m. does not look like a place where history is made. It looks like water. Dark, flat, indifferent water, extending in every direction to a horizon that is invisible in the absence of moonlight. The sky above it a black so complete that the stars embedded in it seem close enough to touch. Surface traffic is sparse at this hour in this corridor, the commercial lanes running further north and the fishing grounds being worked in shallower water to the east. What occupies this particular stretch of deep ocean at this hour is two vessels separated by 11 nautical miles and connected by something more consequential than proximity. One of them, the largest warship afloat. The other has been watching it for 19 days. The USS Gerald Ford was not hiding. Carrier strike groups do not hide. They project. They occupy space in a manner calculated to be noticed. Their presence a deliberate signal transmitted to every government and military command that tracks the disposition of American naval power. The Ford had been in the Arabian Sea for 31 days, conducting the operations that carrier strike groups conduct, the flight operations and exercise cycles and presence patrols whose accumulated weight, over months and years, constitutes the physical expression of a strategic commitment that words alone cannot carry. She was where she was supposed to be, doing what she was supposed to be doing, visible to anyone who wanted to find her and to several collection architectures that had not been waiting to be invited. One of those architectures had a hull number. It had a name painted on its stern. It had a flag of registry and a port of origin and a maintenance schedule and a crew rotation and every other administrative attribute that a vessel operating in international waters is required to maintain. What it did not have, and what the intelligence assessment that had characterized it over the preceding 43 days had concluded with high confidence it was incapable of conducting, was any legitimate civilian purpose consistent with its actual behavior pattern. The vessel had been loitering, not anchored, not in transit toward a destination. Loitering, maintaining a position relative to the Ford's operating area that, while always outside the exclusion zone established by the carrier strike group's surface screen, tracked the Ford's movements with the persistence of a vessel that had a specific interest in the Ford's specific activities and the technical capability to collect against those activities at the ranges it was maintaining. The capability was the issue. If the vessel had been an ordinary fisherman with an extraordinary tolerance for offshore monotony, its presence would have been a curiosity and nothing more. But the signals intelligence collection suite that imagery analysis and electronic emission monitoring had identified aboard the vessel was not the equipment of curiosity. It was the equipment of a sophisticated collection operation targeting a specific signal type in a specific frequency range that corresponded to the Ford's internal communications architecture, its aircraft coordination systems, its strike planning networks, and the electronic emissions of the air wing conducting operations from her deck. The suite had been specifically engineered for this target type. Its presence on a vessel maintaining a persistent loiter position relative to the Ford's operating area was not a coincidence that any serious analyst had spent time considering. The vessel was Iranian, not flagged Iranian. The flag of registry was not Iranian, but the technical signatures of its collection suite, cross-referenced against a database of known Iranian military signals intelligence equipment configurations, had produced a match that the technical assessment team characterized in the precise language such teams use when the match is unambiguous. The crew composition, derived from imagery analysis and a communications intercept that captured several hours of internal vessel traffic during a period when transmission discipline had lapsed below the standard their mission profile required, had been assessed as consistent with a trained military technical intelligence team rather than the civilian maritime crew the vessel's documentation described. The lapse in transmission discipline had been informative. A crew that lapses reflects either complacency from a long and uneventful deployment or a collection operation that has been running long enough that the discipline required to maintain full operational security has been quietly eroded by the rhythms of daily life aboard a small vessel far from home. Both conditions were observable in the intercept. Both conditions had been noted. What the collection operation had been gathering across 19 days of continuous loiter was assessed as significant, not catastrophic. The Ford's communications architecture operated with layered security, and the collection suite's ability to penetrate its most sensitive channels was assessed as limited. But the outer layers of the communications environment, the coordination traffic, the scheduling signals, the electronic emissions of aircraft systems during operational cycles, represented a collection opportunity whose 19-day accumulated product would have translated into a picture of considerable intelligence value. A picture that would eventually travel from the vessel's storage systems to an analysis facility somewhere. A picture that would inform Iranian planning in ways that would persist long after the vessel completed its mission and returned to port. Understanding exactly what that picture contained, what the Iranian collection architecture had been able to resolve from 19 days of continuous observation, required the kind of direct access to the collection system's output that no overhead collection asset could provide. The antenna emissions that had been monitored confirmed the suite was active and collecting. The emissions could not confirm what it was successfully resolving from the signal environment it was harvesting. Those were two different questions, and the second one, the question of what the collection had actually achieved rather than what it had attempted, was the question that mattered most for the damage assessment that the Ford's command would need to make the right decisions about its own operational procedures going forward. The second question had only one answer, and the answer was inside the vessel's storage systems. The collection itself was the threat, not what it had already produced. What it would produce if it was allowed to continue, and what it would contribute to Iranian understanding of American carrier operations if it was allowed to complete its transmission cycle and return home. The authorization had not been simple to obtain. International maritime law is specific about what can be done to a vessel in international waters, and the gap between what the intelligence assessment described and what a legal framework designed for a world of cleaner categories could easily accommodate had required several weeks of careful staff work before the authorization package reached the form everyone in the decision chain could accept. The form it reached described an operation that did not occur in international waters in the sense that mattered for attribution. It described an operation that occurred in a narrow window created by the vessel's own navigation behavior, a behavior pattern that had been studied and projected and was predicted, with the confidence that 19 days of consistent observation produces to create a specific geographic and temporal circumstance that the authorization required. The vessel's loiter pattern was not random. It was a calculated orbit relative to the Ford's operating area, and that orbit, over its 19-day history, had shown a consistent tendency to bring the vessel into a specific corridor at a specific interval of its cycle. The staff work had found the corridor. The staff work had found the interval. The staff work had built the legal framework around both. At 11:34 p.m., the vessel entered the relevant corridor at the predicted interval of its loiter cycle. The tracking architecture that had been monitoring it registered the entry in real time and passed the position update to the operational coordination node. The node confirmed the timing against the authorization parameters. The parameters were met. The confirmation went to the element that had been at readiness posture for the preceding 6 hours. The element that received it did not need to be told twice. The element was not a submarine. It was not an aircraft. It was a surface action group whose composition had been carefully configured to look, in the fleet tracking picture visible to any external collection architecture monitoring the Arabian Sea, like a routine patrol element conducting exercises in the southern approaches. 2 vessels. The larger carried the boarding team and the command and control infrastructure. The smaller was positioned to manage the exclusion geometry that the operation required during its operational phase. Both had been in the area long enough that their presence was an established feature of the regional maritime picture, rather than an anomaly that would draw attention. The larger vessel came to intercept course at 11:41 p.m. Its approach was direct but not aggressive. Its speed calculated to close the distance at a rate that gave the target vessel time to observe the approach and respond through normal maritime communication channels before any physical contact was attempted. This was deliberate. The operation's authorization parameters required that a specific communication sequence be completed before the boarding phase could be initiated. A sequence that would establish in a record that would survive subsequent review the factual basis on which the boarding proceeded. The communication sequence was scripted. Every word had been reviewed by the authorization's legal staff. The officer responsible for transmitting it had rehearsed it 11 times in the 6 hours before the operation began. The first transmission went out on the International Maritime Distress and Safety frequency at 11:47 p.m. It identified the approaching vessel by its designation, described its intent to conduct a safety inspection of the target vessel under the authority of the legal basis the authorization team had identified as applicable, and requested the target vessel's compliance with the inspection. The transmission was recorded on systems that would preserve it in a form that could not be subsequently altered. The target vessel's response came at 11:51 p.m. It was not compliance. It was a transmission on the same frequency that denied the authority being asserted, cited the vessel's flag state's sovereign rights under international maritime law, and requested that the approaching vessel maintain a safe distance. The response had been anticipated. The communications officer acknowledged it and transmitted the second element of the scripted sequence. The approach continued. The larger vessel closed the distance with the methodical certainty of a platform whose crew had already processed every version of this moment and arrived at the same conclusion in each of them. At 12:04 a.m., the larger vessel was alongside the target. The boarding team, 12 personnel, had been at the rail since midnight. They were not in the visual configuration of a military boarding team. They were in the configuration that the authorization had specified, calibrated to the legal framework being employed and to the evidentiary requirements that the operation's subsequent documentation would need to satisfy. The team leader carried a set of documents prepared by the authorization's legal staff that established, in the formal language that official documentation requires, the basis for every action that was about to be taken. The approach alongside had been conducted with the specific care that the operation's evidentiary requirements demanded. The larger vessel had not used aggressive maneuvering. It had not placed itself in a position that would allow a subsequent characterization of the boarding as having been conducted under physical duress. Every action, from the initial communication transmission through the closing of the range to the final positioning alongside, had been performed within the parameters of the authorization's legal framework and the onboard recording systems that had been capturing the entire sequence since 11:47 p.m. had documented all of it. The documentation was not a bureaucratic formality. It was operational infrastructure. The operation's subsequent life in diplomatic and legal channels would depend on the documentation's completeness and integrity, and the team's training had emphasized this with the same weight it had emphasized every tactical element of the boarding itself. The boarding was conducted in a manner consistent with the legal framework the authorization described. The target vessel's crew, 11 personnel, were mustered on the main deck under circumstances that the boarding team leader subsequently described in his report as cooperative after an initial period of uncertainty. Cooperative was the accurate characterization. The crew understood what was happening before the first boarding team member stepped onto their deck. They had been watching the approach for 23 minutes. They had transmitted a report on the encrypted military communications circuit. The report had been received and acknowledged. No assistance was coming. No assistance could arrive in the time available. The crew was professional, and they were realistic, and they chose cooperation over the alternative in the way that professionals in their position, far from home and without the prospect of external support, generally do. The signals intelligence collection suite occupied the vessel's main lower deck and a secondary compartment constructed against the aft bulkhead of the original deck plan in a modification that had occurred after the vessel's civilian construction was completed. The modification was visible as a structural anomaly that any experienced maritime surveyor would have noted. The collection suite itself was powered down. The crew had initiated a shutdown sequence at some point during the approach, presumably when it became clear that the approaching vessel would not be deflected by the communication exchange. The shutdown had been partial. The primary collection processors had been taken offline. The storage systems had not. The storage systems were still powered and still accessible when the intelligence specialist reached them at 12:19 a.m. The intelligence specialist had 40 minutes. That was the planning estimate for the time available before the operational exposure associated with maintaining a boarding in this corridor created risks. The authorization parameters identified as unacceptable. 40 minutes to image, extract, and document what the collection suite's storage systems contained, and to place the technical exploitation package on the relay that would move it to the analysis facility before the element needed to disengage. 40 minutes was sufficient if nothing went wrong. The complication arrived at 12:31 a.m. Not from the crew who remained on the main deck in the passive posture of people who have accepted that the situation is what it is. It arrived from the storage architecture itself. The secondary compartment's storage system had been built with a redundant access control layer that the technical briefing had not characterized, a layer that sat between the extraction drive's interface and the primary storage partition, and that, when the intelligence specialist's extraction sequence encountered it, responded with a lockout that would begin a 30-second timer before initiating an automated overwrite of the partition's contents. The overwrite was the adversary's last defensive measure, automated precisely because it was designed to function without the crew's involvement once the access control layer was triggered. The intelligence specialist had 30 seconds and one option. She had trained on a bypass sequence for access control layers of this generation as a contingency protocol, a sequence she had not expected to need because the briefing had not flagged this specific configuration as likely. But trained for unlikely was the preparation that the moment required. She executed the bypass sequence from memory in 22 seconds. The overwrite timer was suspended at 8 seconds remaining. The primary partition became accessible. She noted the time, recalculated her remaining window, and continued. The extraction package was complete at 12:49 a.m. The documentation package was complete at 12:53 a.m. The boarding team withdrew from the target vessel at 12:56 a.m. The larger vessel moved clear at 12:59 a.m., resuming a course consistent with its established patrol pattern. The target vessel sat for several minutes without moving. Then it began a turn toward the north, away from the Ford's operating area, at a speed that reflected a crew that had concluded the mission was over. The extraction package reached the analysis facility at 4:33 a.m. The analysts who received it began their work before the sun had risen over the Gulf of Oman. What they found in the storage systems took 3 days to fully characterize. 3 days to map the collection's scope, identify the specific signal types that had been successfully acquired, assess the depth of penetration against the Ford's various communications layers, and produce the damage assessment the relevant commands needed to adjust their own procedures in response to what the collection operation had accomplished before it was interrupted. The damage assessment was significant, but not catastrophic. The assessment's principal conclusion was that the collection operation had acquired enough of the outer layer of the Ford's electronic environment to provide Iranian analysts with a picture of American carrier air wing operational patterns that would inform Iranian planning for an estimated 18 to 24 months before the procedural adjustments the assessment recommended would render the collected data operationally obsolete. The collection operation's interruption had not reversed what had been collected. It could not. But it had stopped the collection from continuing, and it had produced an intelligence extraction that gave the relevant commands a specific and actionable understanding of what the Iranian collection architecture had acquired and what it had not. Knowing what the adversary knows is a form of capability whose value is difficult to quantify but impossible to overstate. The difference between responding to an adversary's collection blindly and responding with a precise map of what they collected is the difference between a general adjustment and a targeted one. The assessment made a targeted one possible. The procedural adjustments that followed the assessment's recommendations were implemented across the Ford's communications architecture over a period of 72 hours, timed to align with the scheduled maintenance window that provided an administrative cover for the changes that was not itself classified. The changes were not dramatic in their external presentation. Frequency rotations, encryption updates, scheduling modifications to the sequencing of specific coordination traffic types. The kind of adjustments that happen below the visibility threshold of anything observing the strike group from outside its exclusion zone. From 11 nautical miles, which was the distance at which the Iranian vessel had been maintaining its loiter position, none of the changes would have been observable as changes. They would have appeared as the continuation of normal operations, which was, precisely, the effect they were designed to produce. The Ford continued her operations. Her air wing continued its cycles. Her communications architecture was adjusted in the specific ways the damage assessment had recommended. The adjustments were procedural, invisible from the outside. The strike group's presence remained what it had been: deliberate, projected, designed to be noticed. What had changed was visible to no collection architecture attempting to observe it from 11 nautical miles away. The target vessel filed a formal protest through its flag state's diplomatic channels 48 hours after the boarding. The protest described the boarding as unauthorized and requested an accounting of what had been removed. The response, when it arrived through the appropriate diplomatic channel, addressed the legal question with the precision that the authorization's legal staff had anticipated and declined to confirm or characterize any inspection activity that might or might not have occurred in the relevant maritime corridor on the date in question. 11 nautical miles of observation corridor, 19 days of Iranian collection activity, 40 minutes of exploitation aboard the target vessel. 22 seconds of bypass sequence under a 30-second automated overwrite timer. 18 to 24 months of collected intelligence rendered progressively obsolete before it could be fully leveraged. The vessel that had been watching the Ford stopped watching. The Ford kept flying. The most dangerous collection operation is the one that runs long enough to feel inevitable. The most precise response is the one that removes it so cleanly that the vessel's crew files a protest rather than a casualty report. The Arabian Sea kept moving. The Ford kept flying. The sky above her deck at dawn was clear and empty, exactly as a carrier's sky is supposed to be.